Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at détente. This will include the SALT I and II treaties, SALT II of course failed, and the Helsinki Accords. Quite a lot to cover in this one, so let's get into it. What was détente? The growth of nuclear weapons of increasing power and the increase in sophistication with which these could be delivered had led to a terrifying prospect, MAD, mutually assured destruction. This was the idea that if a nuclear war broke out, then neither side could win. Both would be equally destroyed. This was the ultimate fear, but it was also the ultimate deterrent. No one would start a nuclear war because nobody could finish it. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, though, had showed that though neither superpower wanted war, they could lose control of the situation, and therefore war might happen anyway. In the 1970s, there was a genuine attempt to ease tensions and develop friendlier relations. This was known as détente. So what were the USA's motives behind détente? At this time, the president was Richard M. Nixon. He knew that he had been elected to end the war in Vietnam. He knew also that almost 60,000 Americans had died in that war and it had cost Congress billions. His focus was finishing the fighting in Vietnam, and so he didn't want to be distracted by the competition with the USSR. He also knew that there were huge social problems in the USA. There had been some progress on civil rights in the mid-60s, but the murder of Martin Luther King in 1968, bad living conditions, and massive inequality, particularly between races, had led to riots in American cities. Most of all, perhaps, détente, he knew, could save billions of dollars that were currently being spent on nuclear weapons. He knew that instead he could spend that money on Vietnam and improving living conditions in the USA, killing two birds with one stone, if you will. So these were the motives of the United States. But the USSR had something to gain too. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev knew that the Soviet economy was poor. He knew that Soviet citizens had a bad standard of living compared to the West. Saving money on nuclear weapons would allow them to improve the Soviet economy elsewhere. Also, he was encouraged by the USA's apparently poor performance in Vietnam. It proved that the US armed forces were not unbeatable. He felt secure that they already had enough weapons, including nuclear weapons, to win, and therefore they could feel safe with having a few fewer. Also, the new Chancellor of West Germany, Willy Brandt, was keen to engage more with the East. He called this Ostpolitik, or Eastern politics. Tensions were reducing in Europe, and so again the Soviet leader felt a little safer. This left a little bit of wriggle room for negotiation and to de-escalate tensions between East and West. One of the first demonstrations of détente was SALT I. SALT stood for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It was agreed in May 1972. This was the result of years of negotiations between East and West. Both sides wanted to reduce their stocks of nuclear weapons, thus saving money, but neither side wanted to appear to be backing down in the face of the other, and so it was a hard negotiation. One of the first parts of it was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ABMs. ABMs are designed to shoot down and intercept ballistic missiles. They decided that each side could only keep 2 sites with ABMs, and they were limited to 100 missiles. ABMs are essentially defensive weapons. The fear was that if one side had a massive superiority in anti-ballistic missiles, then they could launch a full nuclear first strike and not have to worry about the retaliatory strike coming in the other direction. This would upset the balance of mutually assured destruction as a threat and a deterrent. The next was the Interim Treaty. Interim means it's only meant to be temporary, and in this case SALT I was intended to only last until 1977. It restricted the numbers of missiles. The USA could have 1,054 intercontinental ballistic missiles and 740 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, like the one pictured to the right. The USSR could have a few more. It could have 1,618 intercontinental ballistic missiles and 740 submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The USSR was allowed a few more missiles than the USA because the USA had such a larger bomber fleet. The Basic Principles Agreement was also an attempt to put some rules in place. It laid down basic rules restricting nuclear warfare, for example, not putting warheads on the seabed. Both sides agreed to exercise restraint, and where war looked likely, to make every effort to avoid this risk, particularly using the fairly newly installed hotline that had been put in after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what was the impact of SALT I? In some ways, SALT I did have important impacts. It showed that the USA and USSR could reach agreements. It showed that both superpowers wanted better relations and therefore a safer world. Shortly after SALT I, Nixon and his security advisor Henry Kissinger visited Brezhnev in Moscow, and in 1973 Brezhnev came to Washington DC. Apparently he was even more shocked by the standard of living that Americans were enjoying, and this demonstrated to him the need to improve the Soviet economy even more. However, there were weaknesses. The treaty was unrealistic in some respects. It was especially unrealistic to expect either side to respect the treaty if war looked likely. Very likely they would try and build up their stocks again. Also, both sides still had sufficient stocks of nuclear weapons to destroy the other over and over again, so in some respects the reduction in missiles was purely symbolic. The treaty did not also specify the latest developments in weaponry, particularly MIRVs, or multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles. This is where one missile would carry multiple warheads that would then split off to land on different targets, making them incredibly difficult to intercept. The next key demonstration of détente were the Helsinki Accords. The superpowers decided to try and build on the cooperation of SALT I by inviting 33 NATO and Warsaw Pact countries to Helsinki, Finland. At the time, this was considered very much neutral territory. Finland was neither part of NATO, nor was it part of the Warsaw Pact. It only joined NATO very recently, in 2023. Their agreements are described as fitted into 3 baskets. Basket 1. European borders were agreed. Borders cannot be changed by force. Basket 2. Closer relations. More trade between Western and Eastern nations, sharing technology, and even a commitment to a joint space mission. And Basket 3. Respect for human rights, freedom of speech, religion and movement across Europe. You'll notice that I've colour-coded these. The first 2 baskets were favoured by the USSR and the last basket was favoured more by the USA. Let's have a look at why. Let's start with baskets 1 and 2. The Soviet Union was very pleased with baskets 1 and 2. This was the first time that the West had formally recognised the post-World War II borders of the satellite states set up by Stalin after the war. Also, sharing technology and trade would boost the Soviet economy, which Brezhnev knew was needed. Indeed, in 1975 there was a joint Soviet NASA space mission with the Apollo-Soyuz mission. Here both a USSR and USA spacecraft docked in orbit, and we can see the astronauts embracing in the photograph. However, the USA was less enthusiastic. One commentator described it in this way. President Ford, who by now had replaced Nixon, flew halfway round the world to sign an agreement in Helsinki which placed the American seal of approval on the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. Essentially, this commentator believed that Ford was sacrificing one of the key principles of NATO and the United States, that they wouldn't recognise Soviet dominance over the satellite states. But here, in an attempt to foster better relations, he seemed to be doing just that. So what was the USA getting in return? That's where basket 3 comes in. Respect for human rights, freedom of speech, religion and movement across Europe. That was easy enough in the Western states, but it was another thing entirely in the East. The USA's main aim at Helsinki had been the extension of freedoms and human rights in the Soviet-dominated countries of Europe. The USSR, though, was concerned about the introduction of inspectors to monitor human rights in the USSR and the satellite states, which they believed would undermine their power over these countries. This was the reaction of the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations after the agreement at Helsinki. The members of the Politburo read the full text. They had no objections when they read the first and second sections, which we've been referring to as baskets. When they got to the third, humanitarian section, their hair stood on end. Some said it was a complete betrayal of communist ideology. But Gromyko came up with this argument. The main thing about the Helsinki Treaty is the recognition of the borders. That is what we shed our blood for in the Great Patriotic War, which is what the USSR and Russia today calls World War II. All 35 signatories are now saying that these are the borders of Europe. As for human rights, Gromyko said, well, who's the master of this house? We are the master, and it will be up to us how we decide to act. Who can force us? So although there were concerns over this in the Soviet Union, they weren't too worried about it being enforced. So they felt that it was a worthy sacrifice for baskets 1 and 2. We now move on to the second Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Helsinki had been the high point for détente, and it was hoped that another Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty might be possible. At first, all seemed well, and the second SALT Treaty was agreed on the 18th of June 1979, and it was signed by Presidents Carter and Brezhnev. Notice that Brezhnev has appeared throughout this story. This was a thing in the Soviet Union. The presidents didn't necessarily change very much, but in a democracy like the United States, the presidents change quite frequently. In this video alone, we have mentioned Nixon, Ford, and now Carter. So what did they agree to in this new treaty? They agreed to restrict the numbers of missiles and strategic bombers in their arsenals, and they agreed to ban testing and deployment of new types of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The agreement was highly technical and complicated. However, other world events show that détente was now under strain. That strain would lead to the failure of SALT II. The USA was increasingly distrustful of the USSR again. Carter's Democratic Party was suspicious of Soviet aims after it had supported communists in South America. They worried that America might look weak making an agreement with an untrustworthy USSR. Carter's own advisers, like Zbigniew Brzezinski, wanted a stronger stance against the USSR, and that's Carter and Brzezinski in the picture. In November, Islamic militants captured the US embassy in Tehran. 60 diplomats and their families were held hostage for 444 days. This was a serious wounding to American pride, as Iran had previously been an ally. And then lastly, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. Something we'll focus on in a subsequent video. This last development, though, was the straw that broke the camel's back. Détente was all but over. SALT II was never ratified by US Congress. Therefore, it didn't count. The USA withdrew. Let's sum up our final points. Détente was the effort to improve relations between the USA and USSR. The USA wanted to save money on nuclear weapons and focus on the Vietnam War and improving living standards in the USA. The USSR wanted to save money to fix its economy, believing that it had sufficient weapons to be safe against the USA. The SALT I Treaty in 1972 limited the numbers of nuclear weapons each side had and encouraged cooperation. The Helsinki Accords in 1975 included 3 so-called baskets of agreements. The first 2 were especially liked by the USSR. Europe's borders were agreed, and there was increased trade and cooperation between East and West, including a space mission. The third basket was favoured by the USA: respect for human rights and basic freedoms. There was an attempt to agree SALT II and further weapons reductions. But world events meant that SALT II was never ratified by the USA, particularly the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan put paid to that. Détente ended in 1979. And this video has ended now. Thanks very much for watching. I hope it's been useful to you. It's been quite a detailed one, so there's a lot covered. If it has been useful, please do like the video and consider subscribing to the channel, which really helps. If there's anything that you're desperate for me to cover next, please put it in the comments below, although I'm going to be releasing a video on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan after this one here. Anyway, enough yakking from me. Thanks for watching and goodbye.